Welcome back to Baer With Me, our special edition celebrating 30 years of the Baer Faxt. I'm your host, Luyang Jiang, and this is the third and final chapter of our journey. Over the past 2 episodes, we have explored the beginnings of the Baer Faxt, the defining moments, and the key challenges that have shaped its evolution. Today, we're closing the series by looking back at one of the most pivotal turning points in the company's history, while also reflecting on what lies ahead. Josh, when we talk about the company's milestones, you brought up a transformative moment in late 2019 when the art world was changing. Competition was growing and the way news was consumed was shifting. You said you started asking yourself, what's next? Let's revisit the moment and the decisions you made about the future of the Baer Faxt.
Yeah, in late 2019, I looked at the newsletter and it's like, wow, the internet's there. Competition for news is there. I'm getting older. What do I do? And I got approached by a media company to buy me. And I thought, well, that could be interesting. It's like, I have a sales team, an administrative team. I have a new thing. I have a new challenge in life. That's like, okay, let's explore that. It's like, instead of always working by myself, I might have senior people that are interesting that have new ideas of what we can become. So I got pretty far along with this company and I realized a couple of things. One, they had no ideas. That was a big problem. Like, I have this thing. How do we grow? What are your ideas? And they had none. So that was like a yellow flag. And then the money wasn't that great. And the point wasn't really, they wanted to buy the Baer Faxt. You know, it was some, but it wasn't like, I'm going to retire to Bora Bora kind of thing. And then there were other issues about what it would become. And I basically left them at the altar in maybe December 2019. But I started to sort of like think, well, how do I make it more interesting for myself to grow? So I could either write it down, slow kind of fade, didn't take much work, and it made pretty good money. But I found it getting a little boring. And if I figured it was getting a little boring to me, probably getting a little boring to my readers. So I said, well, I should start writing editorials. So I should at least start talking about what interests me. Because like I said, if it interests me, probably interests other people. And like, I'll write like my thought of the week or something. And it started to resonate. And people said, hey, that's smart. So that was January, February 2020. I started expanding the newsletter. And then COVID hits. And I'm like, uh-oh. First of all, we're all going to be out of business and we're all going to die. So that was kind of like terrifying moment of March and April of 2020. And then I realized as I was writing my opinions and trying to do some sales within it, I said, oh shit, auctions aren't going to happen. No one's going to be in the room. So my biggest thing of the auction news started like, uh-oh, I can't write the buyers and bidders because there aren't even going to be any auctions probably. And if there are, no one's there. So that was like a terrifying thought. And then what happened was the auction houses morphed and they realized they're going to be out of business if they don't do any sales at all. So they created this idea of making them like TV productions. So suddenly they're trying to figure out how to make them online. And I'm like, okay, so we're going to have auctions and they're going to be online. How do I deal with that? So I had this idea. That's going to be May, June 2020. It's like, I'd watch this thing if you're a sports fan. One of the most favorite thing that happened for sports fans during COVID lockdown is they had the NFL draft. And that's where the college players are taken by their new teams. And they did this live. So they had a studio of like, what are the Jets going to do? What are they going to do? And suddenly they cut to a video of the Jets coach in his house, sitting in his pajamas saying, well, here's what I'm thinking. And then they went to the owner the Green Bay, well, they don't have an owner, of the New England Patriots in his house talking about what just happened. And I went, what if we did that for the auctions? So I had this idea of doing sort of like a pregame or halftime show or postgame video about the auction business. And I would ask Larry Gagosian, hey, Larry, why'd you buy that thing? And Larry'd be sitting in his house in the Hamptons in his shorts going, well, Josh, the Rushmore was the best player available on the field, and to make videos of these things. And it led to making a video production, sort of a magazine that I called first The Hammer, which the Hammer Museum thought I was infringing on their copyrights. No, thank you, Hammer Museum. Really didn't appreciate the legal threats. And I think we called it No Reserve. So we started producing that as like an arts magazine with the art business, the auction business, what happened last night, as a way to make up the fact that there was no buyers and bidders.
You want to know what was my first reaction when I saw that? That was before two of us actually met in person, but of course I followed. When I saw that for the first time, I thought, I'm glad Josh is doing this. And I would have helped him to do a little bit differently. There's a couple of things I think he could do, make it even better. That was my thought. Before I knew that two of us will end up working together.
One of the things about COVID is you had two choices. A lot of people crawled into a hole and waited for someone to give them a handout. Galleries, salespeople, I'm going to say art publications, or you tried out an idea. One of the good things during that period is people were accepting of like, that's a good idea. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but hey, you tried that. And, it worked better or worse. What I discovered there was it was very expensive to do. And it led obviously to something that was more polished, which became our podcast, which was more in depth, better produced, more thought out, and more viably commercially, all those things. So that happened in two steps. One is in the summer of 2020, I got approached again about my newsletter to take investors rather than sell it. And having been down that process once before and having looked through spreadsheets and all sorts of historical things of what ifs, and having started to do some growth, I was better prepared for discussion about what the Baer Faxt might grow into. And I was also growing it at the time. And that's when I took minority investors. So they all sort of led into each other. And within that, jumping ahead another year, that's when we met each other. Mm-hmm. So the 2 years of like how to then change what we've been doing from a position of somebody who's got knowledge and expertise in things that I'm sort of okay at and intuitive, and how to make them better creatively and financially. So it's a long history of trial and error, hundreds of thousands of dollars of effort, and seeing that our audience was paying attention and had a demand for things there, that they had a thirst for more, that we could do more. And we've done a lot more. And what I feel best in is we're recognized for doing way, way more. In the old days, I remember when I started the newsletter, and my second subscriber said to me, and he was chairman of a museum and big collector, and he said, okay, Josh, I'll give you $99 because I want to help you, but this will never last. Okay. And it's been 30 years and he was wrong. It did last.
Is he still our subscriber?
They stopped subscribing after a while. Their daughter, who was a museum director, she subscribed, and they'd be about 100 now. So, but they did it as a favor to me. And I think when we started doing something like podcast, we've done on a regular basis. When we've done op-eds, we do them on a regular basis. When we've added certain issues, we do them on a regular basis. And our readers might have thought, oh, they'll do one and they'll get tired of it. We've never done that. And that's one of the secrets of like being prepared and doing it where the decision is not, oh my God, what am I doing today? Andy Hardy, let's throw a party. And that kind of thing takes a team. It takes me getting input of like, Josh, that's a terrible idea. Here's a better idea. So it's become a village.
You still remember our first discussion when I introduced that idea of the podcast? What did you say?
Well, I will say I still wanted to do video. And part of me is kind of right in that it shows images. And that was always my problem. It's still my problem with the podcast. If I'm talking about an artwork, you don't see it. I'd like to do it. I will say our main investor, LionTree, was saying to me for months and months, podcast. So it's not like the idea wasn't on my radar, but I guess everyone but me turned out to be right. So podcasts. And anybody who knows me knows I'm stubborn. Okay. But they also
You
know
were
I
not very
listen.
convinced when I first told you. And I have been doing podcasts and also, with the experience, and actually I know how to produce with my media background, but I still remember the day one that you're not very convinced. And
I'm still not convinced, but they're great.
But do you enjoy people approaching you, say how much they love our podcast?
I can't walk down an art fair without some stranger coming up to me, or in a restaurant. It's like, if only we had a hat that says, I love the Baer Faxt Podcast. None of these ideas can exist in isolation and need a global plan. So I'm going to say all founders have that challenge of like, how do they go beyond the founder? So how do we take one of the greatest strengths of the Baer Faxt is Josh Baer. One of the greatest weaknesses of the Baer Faxt is the over-identification of the brand to Josh Baer. So that's a challenge of us as a business, as in every founder's business, to like, how do we make the brand stronger than the individual? Because that's the only way you have growth and long-term and larger success. So I don't think what we're going through is unique to me or us. It's typical of businesses of like, when are Ben and Jerry not Ben and Jerry? Or when do you identify the Tonight Show as Johnny Carson or the Tonight Show? And that's something that's we look at as opportunity and risk.
Here's another question from our friend Kat Nansen. Hi, Josh. What was your most memorable auction moment? And what was the best typo, which I do miss, as well as being old enough to remember where it was a fact? Okay, I think that's probably a comment, the second part.
The best typo is when I misspelled my own name. So that's pretty easy. Okay. It's pretty hard to escape on the one hand. But there were two auction moments that stand out. There are going to be like 50,000 people who say they were at Sotheby's in London when the Banksy thing happened. Okay. Mm-hmm. There weren't 50,000 people, but everybody's going to say they were there. And I was there.
How close were you?
Close enough to think this is stupid. Okay. And I still think it's stupid, but I was there for that. So that's a memorable moment. I was there with the Da Vinci being sold for $450 million. And the most memorable part of that is every day, probably for 2 weeks, Louis Gausser, who brought in that sale, would call me up and ask me questions because he was completely distraught about what was going to happen. What should I say? What should I do? What's going to happen? What's going to be? And he would call me literally daily. And I'd say, it's going to be okay. And so being there when that sold for $450 million was pretty memorable. I would say on a personal level, as an art dealer, I've probably participated for my clients in probably 5 world auction records for artists. So when that's happening, that's pretty exciting because it's more exciting because it affects your own wallet. So I've been there for some well-known artists setting what at the time and what sometimes still are world auction records at auction. So Kat, which one? It's like the one that I helped make or the ones that I've seen? They're about tied. So I gave 2 with names and a couple without names. Kat, if you want to know off the record, I can tell you.
Yes, tell me that later.
Platinum edition Baer Faxt.
Okay, my final question. And Patrick, you get to ask a question too, okay? I know you only love great art. And if there's one artist, dead or alive, that you want to own the art of that artist, just one pick, who would that be?
Other than the fact that I generally don't want to own art, but I do. I would say I've always wanted to work by David Hammons. He's maybe my favorite living artist. I used to say I always wanted to work by Charles Ray, but I bought one during COVID lockdown when the art business stopped and I was out of my mind buying art when business went to zero. So I love my Charles Ray, and David Hammons was always too expensive. Now it's like way too expensive. And Patrick, what's your question?
So Josh, my question is, who's on your Mount Rushmore of art dealers?
I would say you have to be historical. So Duveen, everybody's read those books. He's the one who convinced people instead of paying $10,000, pay like $5 million. So he really led a change of the art market. Then the obvious answer is Peggy Guggenheim, because she changed everything in a sense. Obviously, everybody will know that it's Leo Castelli. Listen for our podcast that deals with him with Barbara Castelli. And the art market would not exist as it is without two people, Mary Boone, who made art dealing star-based as the dealer, and then Larry Gagosian, who's the only art dealer in the world that everybody knows who he is. Now, there's other great art dealers. Mount Rushmore used to be 4. Now, well, Mount Rushmore will now have 5 figures because Donald Trump's going to put himself up there. So I think I named 5 for the Mount Rushmore of art dealers. I had a chance to be one of those, and it didn't happen.
One question about art advisor. What's the best advice an art advisor should give? And what is the worst? For people who are looking for art advisor, what are the signs they should look for to define who's a good or bad art advisor?
No.
No for which part?
I mean, that's the most important word they can say is, no, that one's not good enough. No, that one's damaged. No, this isn't the time. No, we shouldn't wait. We have to move now. It's the single most important word in the vocabulary for every top art advisor. And if your art advisor never tells you no, and sometimes no can mean like, don't wait, do it now, then you have the wrong art advisor.
Last question, I promise. Among all the art movements, if you can go back to any art movement, which time period you would like to go to and why?
You mean the fact that I lived through like Cubism and Dada and Surrealism? If I could go back to any one I'd go back to Abex. So it's coming right after the war. When I say the war, not everybody in the world thinks the war is World War II, but to me, when I say the war, that's what I mean. And it's happening in New York. And when I was a kid in the 60s, we'd go to the Cedar Bar. And that's where all the great Abex people would hang out. I remember the story that I think de Kooning made fun of like Franz Klein because he was getting $8 a month from his mom. I may have changed the names, but they'd be sitting around drinking, hanging out then. So for me, I think I'm a huge fan of that period. I wish I had a Clifford Still or a Newman or a Rothko or really a Pollock, my favorite artist. But I'd go back then because the world was changing. Time magazine put it on the cover. Where America's growing out of the war. Europe's coming to America. I grew up as a kid out of the next movements. So I grew up with pop, conceptual, minimalist. But the core that led to it was the abstract expressionists. So, and they drank at the Cedar Bar, which I did when I was a kid too. You're the one drinking whiskey while we're doing this. I have coffee. You're drinking whiskey.
Yeah, but I'm not underage drinking.
Yeah, but.
And I'm just taking a small, but.
Yeah, but.
Okay.
Okay. Well, you're at 7:00 at night. So there you go.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think thank you. I'm not listening to this transcript, so good luck with this release. I'm never going to listen to it.
And with that, we wrap up the final episode of Baer With Me, recorded across time zones. Josh with his morning coffee in New York, and me with a small evening whiskey here in Helsinki. It's a fitting way to close this journey, blending nostalgia, humor, and reflection, much like the Baer Faxt itself has done over the past 30 years. Josh, thank you for sharing not just the stories behind the Baer Faxt, but also the personal memories and the passions that have shaped your perspectives. Whether it's reminiscing about the Cedar Bar or dreaming about owning a Pollock, your insights have been a gift to this series and to our listeners. To everyone who's joined us on this journey, thank you for celebrating this milestone with us. Your support is what keeps this platform thriving, and we're excited for all the stories still to come. Thank you for listening to Baer With Me. I'm your host, Luyang Jiang. Our head of content is Boiliang Shen. Our associate editor is Patrick Hill. And our audio editor for this episode is Auntie Lane. Thank you for being part of this journey and for celebrating 30 years of the Baer Faxt with us.